Good morning, everyone. In this video, I'm going to speak a bit to the importance of revision and give you some strategies and ideas to apply to revision practice. Now, in my face-to-face classes, I usually spend some assigned class time actually going over resources for this at the beginning of the semester, handing out peer review rubrics, handing out the actual rubrics for that section that would be used for grading essays, handing out MLA templates, all kinds of resources to use to help you with revision. So if you are in a face-to-face class with me, do use those resources because they are updated from semester to semester. And often I will change up the essay that I use that students practice revision with from semester to semester. So to begin with, let me type a few lecture notes and ideas that I want to get across, sort of a plan for my goals for this lecture. So the first thing, title it. The first thing I want to get across to all of you is exactly what is meant by revision. And there's a reason I separate the word into its prefix and its root word. And we'll get to that in a minute. The second thing is, what exactly am I looking for in the revised essay? So this is going to be important when you are looking at your papers in the future, when you're looking about how to apply the resources, comments, and marks that I put on your papers as you progress. Because you can think about in my classes, my composition classes, not every composition class is organized this way, but in my composition class, I typically set it up so that every paper or assignment is a learning assignment. What I mean by that is it's an assignment that's going to teach you certain skills and that you should learn certain parts about writing and writing better from the process of doing that assignment. And then you apply those new skills on the next assignment. So you can almost think about each essay as a revision of a previous essay, even though the rubric or the prompt might change from essay to essay. So what exactly am I looking for in a revised essay? That should say a revised essay, speaking of revision. And also the numerous resources available to students to aid in the revision process. So the first thing to talk about here is, what exactly do I mean by revision? So re as a prefix, meaning a word or a phrase or letters that we place in front of a main word that can affect the word's meaning, it means again. And the word vision means obviously to see, right? Or to have a vision, right? So this literally means to see again. The biggest mistake students make with the revision process is believing that it simply means correcting format and grammar mechanics issues. That is not the case. In fact, if you look at most rubrics for essays, the two first columns or rows, or most heaviest weighted sections will be content or organization, and probably both. And both of those parts are completely interconnected. So for example, if I go into this here, I can find, depending on the course, a rubric, a model rubric. Now again, these rubrics might not apply to your school, but they are still worth looking at. I'm gonna find it real quick here. I gotta find the folder that it's in. One of the problems with having so many folders. Let's see here. I thought for sure it was on here. Quick access. Rubric. Oh, come on. We'll find it. It just takes a moment. You just got to do some searching. Ah, here we go. Grading documents. So you'll see, like, for example, this is a rubric for Essay 1, and it's one that's generally used by Sewella currently, or McNeese. It just depends on the institution. And you can look at the self-analysis rubric, and the first two sections, they're actually in rows here rather than columns, are going to be content and organization. And you notice that they're weighted the heaviest, 30 points and 25 points. So over half of the paper's grade is going to be tied up in content and organization. Now, when students limit themselves to only focusing on grammar and mechanics and format, they are missing the proverbial forest for the trees. What I mean by that is they're missing the obvious issues. So if you think about writing as being primarily delivery of complex ideas in a clear fashion, literally communication, a way to communicate complex ideas to people who are not present, people who you cannot talk to in that moment, then you start to understand the importance of clarity and organization in content. The way we learn things, the way we understand things, the way knowledge is easily transferred from person to person is by having it organized in a logical fashion. So if that is missing, but the grammar and mechanics are perfect or the format's perfect, you still have a bad paper. So if there's no quality content and there's no clear organization, it doesn't matter whether every period is in the right place. Plus, if you have to change, if a student has to change any content or reorder sentences, paragraphs to improve organization, it will likely affect the grammar and mechanics. And what I mean by this is when you change content or organization in a paper, chances are you're going to have to change some of the wording, some of the sentences, some of the syntax, the diction, those sorts of things. When you change those things, obviously the sentences will have to be rewritten, the paragraphs will have to be rewritten, which means you have a likelihood of making more grammar and mechanics mistakes in that process, in that revision process. So when you see a paper again, when you are performing revision, the student's first task is to examine the content and the organization. And if anything is unclear or doesn't make sense or is illogical, the student needs to focus on improving that first. I always recommend steps for improving content. I always recommend that students start when they're first examining the content of their or other students' papers with looking for clearly identifiable examples. Now, what that means is if you want to find clearly identifiable examples, you need to know what an example is. So examples are not opinions. So when students quote other people from sources and their quote is literally just that person saying the same thing that their thesis says, that is not an example. Expert opinion is not an example. It's useful, but it does not make me believe your argument. So what are examples? Well, examples are stories, images, charts, graphs, statistics, direct quotes from literary sources, things like that. So you'll need to know, the difference between primary and secondary sources. You'll need to know that if you are talking about a literary work and you're doing literary analysis, then your best examples are actually close readings of the text and examples from the actual readings. If you are doing a paper talking about multiple personality disorder and how that impacts family relationships, your best examples will be stories about people with multiple personality disorder and how it affected their family relationships, rather than just quoting somebody who says multiple personality disorders have a negative effect on family relationships, right? So you want to make sure that in their paper or your paper, the first thing you look for are those examples, and you want to make sure that those examples are not opinions. The next thing, when you're looking at examples, you want to make sure that the examples are also from credible sources. Believable sources. So that means it is easy to track the source down. The source passes the CRAP test. Now, this CRAP test is an acronym that a lot of libraries use, and it's real easy to find. So rather than taking time in this video to give you information about the CRAP test, I'm going to tell you in the video to do a Google search on CRAP test and information literacy, or do a Google search on CRAP test and website, and read about it and watch some videos about it and look at the rubrics that are out there. There's literally thousands of websites that will give you information on this test and variations on this test that you can use to help you determine whether something is a good source or not. Now, a question students always ask me, and you can see this in some of the papers I've given you to revise, is if the source only gives you an initial for the last name, what would you do for the parenthetical citation? To understand what I mean there, you need to know about the rules of parenthetical citation. For example, in parenthetical citation or in an introductory clause in MLA, we always use the author's last name. We never use an author's first name. So if all we have is an initial, that to me falls under 2A here. It is easy to track the source down. If there is major source information missing, it is likely not a reliable source. My feeling is, as far as intellectual pursuits are concerned, the sorts of things you would be writing about in a college class, if the writer, online, website, database article, what have you, is unwilling to place their name on it, chances are the information is less reliable than someone who's willing to have some skin in the game. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. So you need to make sure that you have identifiable examples and the examples are credible. And then the next part is make sure the examples are connected back to the thesis statement. So in each section of the paper, the author of that essay needs to connect those examples and explain those examples in the context of their thesis. They need to explain to us how their evidence supports their argument. If either of those things are missing in the paper, it does not matter how great the grammar, the spelling, the mechanics, or the formatting is. There isn't a paper. So when I'm looking at a student model paper, per se, this compare and contrast paper, what I'm looking for actually first, before I've done anything else, is I'm going to look and make sure that this content is good and that this content is reliable. I'm going to check their sources. I'm going to make sure that I can clearly see that there's evidence and not just opinion listed in here. I'm going to check all of those things, right? And so right away, I know this isn't a good paper because all they've given me here are these searches, right? Their citations are incorrect. So I know that this is far from what it's supposed to be. So right off the bat, before I've even dealt with proofreading, editing, our format, our mechanics, or any of that, I'm dealing with content. And then I'm also going to use what I know about correct content and organization to make sure that the organization is proper. So the first thing I look at is content. But then I make sure that the content is organized effectively. Now, the hang up that students have with this is they often don't know what that means. So there's basic essay organization, which I've already explained in another lecture video. You can go watch that lecture video to get that idea. But then there's some other organizational principles. There's things like, let me write this down. You have least to most. Hopefully that'll autocorrect. Nope, it didn't autocorrect. Can't depend on autocorrect, which is good. You have least to most important or most to least important. You have, that's when you put the least important example and one paragraph and the final paragraph is the most important example, and you organize those things in order from least to most, or you flip that and you go most to least. You also have what's called chronological. That's when you're telling something like in a memoir type essay or a personal essay where you're giving things in order of events. You would give them how they happened. You can also organize things spatially using the environment or the setting to discuss the idea. And then when you get to more complex rhetorical modes like compare and contrast, you have things like organizing by subject or point-by-point comparisons. And again, those are things to look at in those specific rhetorical modes, but those are organizational principles to look at, as whether they've organized each section of the paper by the subject or by the points. So there's others out there, but those are the main ones to think about when you're thinking about organizational principles. The key with organization is make sure it is logical. What that means is it's easy to follow, it's clear, it makes sense. So you, with an MLA paper, you start with the argument. The last sentence of the first paragraph or the first section of the paper, the introduction, needs to be your thesis, unless your faculty member tells you they prefer it as the first sentence. Some faculty members will prefer that. But usually it's good to have a bit of an introduction that sets up the argument, introduces the ideas, and then presents the argument. Once you have that, you set up the thesis, and then you spend the rest of the paper basically proving your thesis for your reader using clear examples. If the text is not organized in a way that makes sense, it makes it very hard to follow. Again, thinking about this model rubric from different institutions, the thing that is almost always weighed the most, the two things that are weighed the most, almost half of the paper, is going to be content and organization. So obviously, if you're revising to improve your paper, those are the primary things that you're going to deal with. Now, you do have to deal with sentence structure. You see that. You do have to deal with vocabulary, mechanics, grammar, and formatting when it comes to essay format. But you notice that these things are worth about 45 or less % of your paper. So those things are important, but they are secondary. That's like, if you think about, I don't like to assign certain numbers of drafts. I don't like the idea that, because some students can do really well with grammar and mechanics in one draft, and some students do really well with content in one draft, and some students need 4 or 5 drafts before they get to where they need to be. But if you think about this as a process, your first step in writing an essay is to gather the details and develop the thesis. And that requires research, reading, lecture, all of that. And you start to take notes and organize those things. That's where you can create an outline. You can use some of the strategies I've explained in other videos or that are explained in your textbooks. The next step is writing what Anne Lamott calls in her essay Shitty First Drafts, the child's draft. And what I mean by this is the draft where you just get the ideas on the page. You don't really worry about grammar. You don't really worry about mechanics. You don't really worry about content organization format. You just get your ideas on the page. The problem is a lot of college students, and that's my primary audience, stop right there. Because they decide to write their papers an hour or 2 hours or 4 hours before they're due. And that's when you end up with essays like the model essays that I give students at the beginning of the semester in my classes that I ask them to revise. That's where you end up with those sorts of quality essays, because you stop right there and you never take the time, and I'm using the general you for all students, students don't take the time to revise. So the next step, the step that they always miss, is the next step is to revise with a focus on content and organization, like I talked about here. Then the next step is to proofread for grammar, mechanics, and formatting. So the revision step and the proofreading step, or editing step is sometimes what it's called at other institutions, are really two separate steps. I talk about them as similar things, but I almost think of them as separate drafts. So I write, when I first started this and I got into the habit of what worked for me, what I would do is I would gather all my data in that sort of research journal I show my Comp 2 students, and then I would write my child's draft. And then I would go in and revise for content and organization. And then I would go in and proofread for grammar, mechanics, and formatting. And that process has served me very well moving forward with college level papers and papers to present at institutions and conferences and to publish. So I think it works really well, and that's what I teach my students. That's the process I want you all to embrace. Now, how you go about that process is really going to be up to you. But what I've noticed often with students who submit this revision, let's say this is the draft that I gave you, what they do is they go in here and they go, oh, well, I know this format's incorrect, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that comma, and I'm not really going to read this. I'm just going to skim through. You know what? I'm in a real hurry. I got to go check Facebook or play Fortnite, so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to look for review, and I'm going to put up the Where is it? Oh, spelling and grammar. And I'm just going to let this fix it for me. So I'm going to fix that. Oh, I know that's incorrect. I know that's not good spelling. I know that's not good spelling. I know that's not good spelling. And I'm just going to let it correct that for me. And you know what? It looks pretty good. They have indents here, so it must be a good paper. And I'll tell you what, I don't really feel like looking up these sources and checking these sources. So I'm just going to leave it, and I'm going to save it, and I'm going to submit it like this. And they call that revision. You call that revision. And you submit that, and then you get 10 points or 20 points, and you say, I can't believe I got a bad grade. But look how much time that took. And did you really apply what I talked about with the revision process here and these levels? If you look at this, you notice that this is a time-intensive process. Students need to get this through their minds that writing should take time. It needs to take time. Students need to set aside time to write well. And the bulk of that time needs to be focused on revision, and really the drafting and the proofreading stages. Those are very short, very small stages. Those things can, if you know enough, if you've been paying attention in the class that you're writing for, or you've done a lot of outside reading, those things can be knocked out in a couple hours. But the revision stage really needs time. It really needs time. And the number one mistake students make is not giving themselves enough time to do these things. You can see how this would take time. So revision, the next stage, once you've looked at content organization, is to proofread. And I still have students that turn in that paper without actually having applied elements like MLA format. So there are literally thousands of resources I show my students in class. I put links on the LMSs for you. Those are the learning management systems for you, but I'm going to put it in the video here just in case there's a student who's not in one of my classes who's watching this. And just in case there's a student out there who doesn't click links on learning management systems, that often happens, or at least that's what I understand happens, because I get papers with students who haven't made these corrections in the proofreading process. So once you've gotten past the revision process, your next stage is the proofreading and editing process. And the first thing I always recommend is to check with your faculty member about proper formatting. Now, in most English classes, you're going to use MLA. If you want to know anything about MLA, you can literally type into your search engine what I have just typed in, Al Purdue MLA. It brings up this MLA formatting and style guide. You saw that took less than a second to do. It takes less time than checking your Facebook feed. You go in here and you can use their table of contents on the side. There is a sample paper, and you literally download this paper and you look at it and you compare it and contrast it to the paper that you're supposed to revise. All right, so I can look first at the heading and header, and I'm leaving the student's name off here, but I can look at the heading and header and I can say, is that formatted correctly? I can look at the draft and I can say, yes, now it's formatted correctly. I can look at the title. So I can see here in the model paper, this is a much more interesting title. So I think maybe I need to revise the title, because content, compare and contrast, is the name of an assignment. It's not the name of the paper. But this requires that I read the actual paper that was handed to me rather than just skim it. So you actually have to read the assignment. Whoa, big thing to do there, right? So once you've read it, and you can come up with a better title. So for now, I would just say title to be revised, right? Okay, so once I've done that, I go in here and I can start checking. And as you can see here, one of the problems I have, especially in a lot of the classes I teach, is this student is using the word you way too much. And I know that there's a great document in my classes that I teach called Writing Reminders, or Things That Make Writing Teachers Cringe. And item 10 in there literally says, don't use second person, which is what you is. So I can apply this document and I can go in and I can revise all of those sentences and take that out. If you is anywhere in the revision or proofreading paper that you hand back, you have not done this very important step, and it's basically a giant red flag to your faculty member that you don't care about the assignment. And again, how would that impact your grade? So things to think about moving forward. The next thing is I can see from just looking at this paper, and this is one instance where proofreading and editing, if I haven't caught this in the content and organization, the revision stage, I can see there's no in-text citation at all. There's almost no connecting it to the sources. And I know from looking at the model paper and from what almost every faculty member has probably ever told me about writing, that if there is not an in-text citation and a works cited entry, I've basically plagiarized, because there's no way to track where my information came from. So I got to go in here and I have to fix that. And that's something that's more revision and less proofreading, but I can use this model from Al at Purdue to help me see exactly what it looks like. So that is clearly not a year, that is clearly a page number. So if I encounter a citation in the model paper that I've given that says something like 1918 and there's no page numbers in the works cited entry, then that logically means that they're using a year, which is APA, not MLA. So I need to go in and check their sources and find their page numbers. And I understand that that's time consuming and there's other things that people would like to do, but it's an important thing to do and to get correct. Otherwise, you're basically ignoring the very clearly stated rules of academic writing. And ignoring those rules basically leads to plagiarism and can create major issues in the future with people believing in your credibility as a writer, which is a big part of this, is making sure that people also see you as a credible person. So once you have done that, you've looked at those and you've compared those things, you can start revising and editing and proofreading. So that is just one resource that's available to you on that website. There's more. Literally, you can go in here. If you don't know how to do the citation, you can use their citation generator to help you improve the citation in the paper. There's a link here on how to do in-text citation and the basics of how to do that, and I often will attach this as a PDF to students' papers when they are making errors with in-text citation. And the truth is, it is your job to go in here and figure out how to do this in the revision and proofreading stages. That is your job. Students are often will be like, well, Dr. Rather, why don't you just tell me exactly what I need to do? Well, the thing is, if I tell you, I've probably already told you exactly what you need to do because I've typed it out in a lecture video or in class during face-to-face lecture. But two, if I tell you exactly what you need to do in every instance, you're not going to remember it outside of the class. You need to know that resources exist and then figure out how to use those resources to do it yourself, because you're going to have to write term papers and essays in other classes with teachers who are not going to teach you how to do this. They're going to expect that you already know how to do it. So it is your job to go in here at Al at Purdue or any sort of handbook, if you have a handbook, a printed handbook, and look up how to do this. And if you have any doubt as to the ease of finding this information, again, if you're somebody who's not really into text, you can literally go in here and you can search for something like how to cite movies in text and MLA. And as you can see, there's literally video after video after video after video, just like these videos I'm posting for you now, that explain it. And they explain different types of citation. So if you're more of a visual learner and you learn more from videos than from lectures, it's there. You just have to use it. And so I'm baffled when I get papers like the paper I'm using here as an example. I'm baffled when I get papers with something like this, because it's so easy to avoid this issue. It really is so easy, and it's the difference between an A and a C. And it really sends the message of a lack of credibility or laziness, which are not the sort of messages that students really need to be sending to their faculty members. And as you can see, learning how to do that, typing up and getting that information literally takes less time than it takes for most video games to boot on a video game system. So you've got the time. It's just, how do I use the time to effectively? And people don't always equate the two things. So anyway, again, if you are being tasked with a revision assignment, whether it's revising someone else's paper or revising your own paper, you need to start not with grammar, mechanics, and format. Start with content and organization. And fixing those things, you will more than likely, if you are wise, you are more than likely going to catch many grammar and mechanics issues and formatting issues. Once that draft has been completed, go back in, and that's when you proofread and edit and you fix format, grammar, and mechanics. Make sure your content and organization is good first. Make sure you have good sources, and then go in and fix those issues of citation. And with citation and grammar and mechanics, there literally is no excuse in the 21st century for making those sorts of errors other than laziness. Now, there are some things like homonym issues, like the wrong word error. Those things aren't a big deal. They are, but they're not, if that makes sense. You should try to catch them, but if you have the wrong version of 2, it's not the end of the world. But if you haven't included any in-text citations in your paper because you're too lazy to go look up Al at Purdue how to do it, that is going to look really bad. And your faculty member is going to think that you're not a reliable person. That is the signal that you are sending. Remember, writing is communicating more than just ideas. It's also communicating something about you and your investment in the class. And when you get outside of composition classes and you're into major courses, let's say you're going for a 4-year degree and you do that sort of thing, it's going to look even worse. And that faculty member will often not even bother with your paper. I've had papers that weren't done correctly that actually were given back to me because of those sorts of issues without a grade. So although I'm sorry this video is quite long, I think this is one of my most important videos because it is the lesson I want students to learn at the beginning of the semester before they're starting to turn in papers that actually affect their grade in a very large fashion. And before they start turning in their papers, do not be the student who turns in a paper like this. Do not be the student who does what I just did, where you just use grammar and spell check and run through it real quickly and don't even look at the content. You have resources. You have a textbook. You have tutors. You have more resources than almost any generation in college in the history of humanity. Use them so you can get a good grade. Put yourself through this revision process. We want to see you succeed, but that success is ultimately in your hands.